If you're familiar with Kubernetes, and you might have already used pods and services and deployed this either within development cluster or your production cluster even, you might know about the different types of services that you can use. And in a lot of documentation, you introduced quite early to the different types. That's a flaw. Let me tell you why. So, as discussed in previous videos, you have 3 different types. You can have a cluster IP, and in most of the cases, 95%, you will use a cluster IP. Then you have a node port. The node port makes the information, the access, the routing accessible of your pods within the cluster, so other pods can communicate with that pod. And then the last type is a load balancer. Now, a load balancer makes the processes and information that are within the pods, that are running within the pods, accessible to the outside world. Now, in most cases, you would want to use a cluster IP and connect that with an Ingress controller. Let's have a look at what that is. Hey there! For those who are new to my channel, welcome! It's really great to have you here. I've made it my personal mission to document my entire learning process across the DevOps space, and right now I'm focused on Kubernetes. Specifically, I'm doing a challenge called 100 Days of Kubernetes, where I aim to learn something new related to Kubernetes across 100 days. So welcome! Join me along this challenge, and let's go! Okay, let's quickly recap where your Ingress controller and your Ingress resource would fit into your cluster. So let's assume this is our Kubernetes cluster. And then within the Kubernetes cluster, we have, within our main node, we have our API server. And the API server is responsible to accept our kubectl requests. So we want to install on our server first Ingress controller if it doesn't have one yet. So we would install an Ingress controller, Ingress, and the Ingress controller needs to have a load balancer connected. Load balancer. Okay, and then we have some worker nodes. I think this is about how it's gonna look like. Anyway, so we tell it has to have an Ingress controller, and then the load balancer. The Ingress controller connects with the load balancer. And we basically tell over the kubectl commands, we tell our Kubernetes cluster, hey, we want to create a new Ingress resource that is responsible to accept requests for this and this service from the outside. What happens next is that the Ingress controller basically checks the API server within the main node consistently whether or not a new Ingress resource has to be created. And once it sees the request, it will create a new Ingress resource in our cluster. So we will have Ingress. And that's Ingress. And actually, this doesn't communicate. The Ingress controller creates Ingress, and then the Ingress communicates with the load balancer. So when we get our external request, so for example, this is our example.com. Let's say that. This is example.com. Both of those nodes run pods that have example.com on it. And then somebody outside says, hey, I want to access it. I want to access this page, this web page. Yeah? And that's a web page. And the load balancer is basically responsible to spread the requests between those pods that are available and accessible and run the application to fulfill that request. So through Ingress has, like, let's say the example.com. And then it goes to load balancer, and load balancer decides whether it should go to the pod that runs in this node or the pod that runs in this node. I know, really beautiful drawing, but I think you get the idea. I hope so. If not, let me know in the comments, please. And then we can try to figure it out together. Okay, cool. So this is basically, for example, pod1.example.com, and this is pod2.example.com. And they will then send an answer back, and then over Ingress, it's displayed back to the website of what that person wanted, that request. Now, what is the idea behind this? Why do we want this instead of directly accessing the pod that is within our cluster. This is a pod. Well, so as discussed in previous videos, when we spin up a new pod, it will get a new IP address, a new endpoint within our cluster, where we can send requests to. So pods are really short-lived. They die really quickly and get spin up through replica sets or other mechanisms in your cluster. Usually replica sets, or just if you specify a deployment with a specific pod, if that pod dies, it's just going to be spin up again by your cluster. So we have a new pod, and that has a new IP address. So then we have a service that basically wraps around this pod, and that's not displayed in this example. So this is the service, and that service has a specific, like discussed, either cluster IP, or node port, or load balancer. But we don't want a load balancer because we want it to communicate with Ingress, with our Ingress resource. So that's what it's going to do instead. And then we can have, well, Ingress is also communicating with the load balancer that then spreads the service requests. So what I'm not 100% clear, but maybe you know it, and then you can comment it below. That would be really, really awesome. Whether or not the service communicates with the load balancer, or with the Ingress, or the Ingress communicates with the load balancer, and the load balancer with the service. Anyway, so this is about how it works. Okay, it's highly specific how you can connect an Ingress or install an Ingress controller in your cluster depending on what cloud provider and cluster you use and so on. So I highly suggest you to check out the Nginx controller documentation. Ingress controller documentation. Also, I've just listed some of the resources here and some of the things that you can do, for example, on Minikube. On MicroK8s, it requires you to set up, to make your host IP address, the Ingress IP address, and I didn't feel too comfortable doing that. So I didn't set that up with my MicroK8s, but I set up with my Google Cloud. So I'm here on the wonderful UI at CodeFresh, where I see my Kubernetes cluster with all of my namespaces. And as you can see here, I installed the Ingress controller on my Google Cloud, and here's my public endpoint. Now, if I go on it, I can't see anything. There's nothing running there right now. Nothing is connected to that Ingress controller right now. And I don't have an Ingress set up that is connected to the Ingress controller. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, I have here a Python example app that I will be using in a webinar quite soon with a really cool company called Workout. So link below, check that out. Anyway, so for the setup, I was playing around with Ingress as well as just setting up all the resources, but I used a Helm chart for it. I'm a bit more familiar with Helm than like using pure YAML to set all the resources up. So just to give a quick walkthrough to show you what I'm doing here, I have my Helm chart, and within that I have a values file where I can set Ingress just enable to true and then the path, and that allows me to really quickly set up an Ingress within my cluster. Now it will place those values from the values YAML into my Ingress YAML file, as well as my deployment YAML file and all the others such as service YAML file. So I just have to go ahead and do, if I'm connected to my cluster, kubectl config current context. So as you can see, I'm connected to my Google Cloud cluster, and now I can just go ahead and do helm install and then Ingress example, and this is the path to my Helm chart and in the namespace demo. So I can go ahead and do that, and that should set it up, all the resources magically, through Helm. So here we go. As you can see, it's not too practical, this IP here. So what I can do if I have something like CodeFresh, in this case I have my IP address, and I can just go ahead when I refresh now, I see my to-do app. That's also developed by the folks at Workout, so pretty cool app. Anyway, so what can I do if I don't have access to something like CodeFresh? Well, I can go ahead and say kubectl get namespace, and you would have to write kubectl right, and then you might get as well something. So I have here, as you can see, after installing the Ingress controller, I have a namespace called Ingress Nginx. So I can go ahead and list everything that I have within my Ingress Nginx namespace. So namespace and an Ingress Nginx. It's gonna go ahead and do it. And as you can see, I have a service called Ingress Nginx Controller, and that has an external IP address, and that's the same one that's currently running, like where the application is running. And that's one way I went about it. It probably will vary depending on which cluster you're using. I put some example commands and how you could use it, for example, on Minikube here in that public Notion page, also linked below. So check that out. I hope this was useful.
Thank you so much for watching. Now, if you made it this far, it must be that you're serious about learning DevOps, or specifically Kubernetes, and you might want to join our DevOps learning group, where we share free online learning resources. If you do want to join, just message me on Twitter. I would love to add you. I hope this was useful, and to see you next time. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.